It's so wonderful to be here. I had a great night. I came into Philadelphia last night, and they put me up at a nice hotel. And I was in the lobby of the hotel this morning, about to come over here, and this young woman, she just ran up to me. She was so excited. She kind of threw her arms around. She said, "I know you, don't I?" And I said, "Well, I'm not sure, ma'am." It was really endearing. She kept looking up, and she goes, she said, "I'm sure I've seen you on TV." And I just kind of smiled at her. I said, "Well, I don't know, ma'am." I said, "You know, what do you watch?" And she kept looking at me, and she finally, the light bulb went on. She goes, "Wait a minute." She said, "Didn't I see you on Wheel of Fortune last week?" And yes, ma'am, that was me. I am a Fox News contributor. How many of you watch Fox News? Any of you? About half of you. Any of you watch MSNBC? You're probably in the wrong room. No, I'm just kidding. My day job, I am with the Wall Street Journal, and I'm also with the Heritage Foundation. For the last 10 years, I've worked as the senior economics writer for the Wall Street Journal editorial board. And I wonder how many of you read the Wall Street Journal editorial page pretty regularly. About a third of you do, maybe as many as half. Maybe the best piece of kind of professional advice that I can give you today, because I know a lot of you are, how many of you are seniors and graduating? A lot of you are. You know, as you look forward to your work life and the real world, the one piece of advice I could just give you that can kind of prepare you as well as anything is just in the morning, you know, when you have your Starbucks coffee, just take 10 or 15 minutes and read the Wall Street Journal editorials. We labor over those. We have some of the best writers and thinkers in the country. It's a very kind of pro-business, free enterprise-oriented newspaper. Our slogan at the Wall Street Journal for the last 75 years has been free minds, free markets, and free people. So and by the way, we don't just cover financial news, and we're not just covering the economy. We cover everything from, you know, what's happening in social issues, legal issues, what's happening, you know, in every corner of the globe, and even, you know, we even have stuff on, you know, a lot of stuff on politics. So it's just a great way to get a nice synopsis of what's happening in the world. And by the way, I should say that the newspaper business, any aspiring journalists in the room? Maybe one or two of you. I mean, journalism is a tough profession these days. The newspaper business is hardly flourishing. And, you know, there's 5 major newspapers in the country today that are the national papers. There's the Wall Street Journal, there's the USA Today, there's the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the LA Times. And of those 5 major daily newspapers, only one of them is making money. Anybody want to guess what paper that is? It's the Wall Street Journal. But even better news, by the way, is, you know, the New York Times. I know I saw the New York Times on campus this morning. The New York Times is about this close to being in federal bankruptcy court, and it just couldn't happen to a nicer group of people. just teasing. So I wanted to, by the way, did you all see, I was watching CNN this morning in my hotel room, and President Obama this morning was in Michigan. Did you all see this? And he was giving a talk about his education agenda, and he went to this grammar school, and he was giving this talk to these 5th graders, and it's just kind of funny to see this on TV. And he actually took questions. Did you see this? He took some questions from these 5th graders, and this one little boy raised his hand, and the president said, you know, "Son, what is your name?" And he said, "My name is Oliver." And the president said, "Well, Oliver, what is your question this morning?" And Oliver said, "Well, Mr. President, I was just wondering, you know, if you have any regrets about what happened in Benghazi, you know, because, you know, we lost our ambassador, and I'm just wondering if you think, you know, you made a mistake in not reacting more quickly to the crisis there." And you can kind of see the president, he's kind of straightening out his tie, and you're taken aback by this. And the little boy says, "And I just have one other question. You know, you had said that if you like your health insurance, you'll get to keep it. But my parents just recently lost their health insurance, and I wonder what you would say to people like my parents. Did you lie, Mr. President, to the people when you said you'd be able to keep your health insurance?" Well, you know, President Obama is kind of stunned by this, and all of a sudden the recess bell rings, and all the kids file out, and sure enough, like 20 minutes later, they file back in, and the president says, "Now, where were we? Oh, yes, I was taking questions. Are there any questions from the kids?" And this little girl in the front of the room raises her hand. The president says, "You know, dear, what is your name?" And she says, "My name is Grace." And, "Well, Grace, what is your question?" She says, "Well, I only have 2 questions for you this morning, Mr. President. The first question I have is, why did the recess bell ring 15 minutes early today? And second of all, what the hell happened to Oliver?" So, you know, there's a lot of executive privilege going on in the White House. All right, so I want to have just get a bit of kind of fun with you and talk a little bit about try to make the economy interesting, and maybe a little bit of politics, and then save some questions from you all, because I'm actually interested in what is on your mind. So let me start this by saying that when you look at the overall U.S. economy, I want to just talk about what's happening recently in the U.S. economy and the kind of most important recent trends. And as I look at the economy, I'm an economist. That my job at the Heritage and at the Journal is to really focus on what are the kind of breakthrough trends that are happening in the U.S. economy, and what's the outlook. And one of the most interesting things about the U.S. economy over the last 5 or 6 years is that if you look at the economy overall, we haven't done very well. You know that this has been a very, very meager recovery, to say the least. We are in a recovery. The recovery began in June of 2009, but this is the weakest recovery we've seen since the Great Depression. So it's not a lot to write home about. And what's most interesting to me is that if you look, there's one industry in the United States that over the last 5 years has almost literally been carrying the rest of the U.S. economy on its shoulders. That it accounts for almost all of the growth in the U.S. economy, and the rest of the economy has been almost flatlined over the last 6 years. And what industry is that? Yeah, I mean, I heard a couple of you say it. It's the energy industry. We are living, you all understand this living in Pennsylvania, but we are living through the biggest oil and gas boom in American history. And this is something that nobody would have predicted 7 or 8 years ago. Nobody believed this, even 3 or 4 years ago. I mean, as recently as 2010, President Obama was running around the country giving speeches about how we're running out of oil and gas, and we have to move to windmills and solar power because we're running out of this scarce natural resource of natural gas. And he was, of course, wrong on that, because, Mr. President, we're not running out of natural gas and oil in this country. We're running into it in a big, big way. And it's an amazing story because, well, let me just show you one chart to show you what's going on here. This kind of encapsulates what I'm trying to show you and tell you is that if you look at this red line, that's all non-farm employment in the country over the last 6 years. And then if you look at the blue line, that's the growth of the oil and gas industry. And you can see, a totally divergent path here. And without what is happening here, we would almost definitely still be in a recession today. We wouldn't have even escaped from the terrible economic crisis we had in 2008 and 2009. So this is a real important story. And the way I like to relate this to you all, again, you're here in Pennsylvania, so you, I think, have a special appreciation for this. But let me ask you all, I want to ask you questions as I go along. But how many of you know, anybody in this room know what state among the 50 states in the United States today? Anyone know what state has the lowest unemployment rate? What? North Dakota, exactly. How many of you knew that, by the way, that North Dakota? A few of you did. North Dakota's unemployment rate today is officially 3%, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But I'm here to tell you that is a bald-faced lie. The unemployment rate in North Dakota is not 3%. It's negative. They have a negative unemployment rate in North Dakota. That is to say, there are about 15,000 more unfilled jobs in North Dakota today than there are people to fill the jobs. I work in Washington, D.C., and then I go up to New York. I spend 1 or 2 days in New York a week. So I'm going back and forth between Washington, D.C. and New York. And when I'm walking down the streets of, like K Street in Washington or in the streets of Manhattan, you see these panhandlers all the time at every street corner. I say, go to North Dakota. That's where the jobs. They don't like that. How many of you have ever even been to North Dakota? Raise your hand. A few of you have. I mean, I have to confess, I had been to every single state in the United States multiple times, at least the continental states, but I had never been to North Dakota, and I went there 2 years ago to see what was going on with this, energy revolution that I'm talking about. And it was really an amazingly fascinating trip, because I went to this little town of Williston, North Dakota. And Williston is a town that used to be, you're up in the Great Plains. You're up near the Canadian border. There's not a lot up there. Basically, for the last 100 years, what people have been doing in North Dakota is growing wheat, right? They're wheat farmers up there, and it's only 500,000 people live in the entire state of North Dakota. And so this little town of Williston is a wheat farming town, except guess what? Williston sits atop of something called the Bakken Shale. And the Bakken Shale is the biggest oil and gas find in North America in the last 50 years. And so what you've got is this incredible migration of people every day into this little town of Williston. It used to be about 6,000 people, before the oil boom started. And then it was 15,000, 20,000, 25. It's like those old Western movies you used to watch where you'd see on screen the town's almost growing up right before your very eyes. That's what it feels like in Williston. I had to spend $329 to stay at a Best Western hotel in Williston, North Dakota, because literally there's just nowhere to stay there. It's booming so much that the strippers are leaving Las Vegas and they're going to Williston because there's more jobs there. So that's a lot of growth. And so what's happening, I spent about 2 or 3 days with the geologists who kind of explained to me what's happening there. And look, that oil and gas that's been in the Bakken Shale, that's been there for millions of years, right? It's taken a long time for the earth to formulate this oil and gas. And we've known for 100 years the oil and gas has been there. We just never had the technological capacity to go and get at it. And in fact, this oil and gas boom, I mean, this is one of the central points I want to get across to you, that this isn't about the United States being such a resource-rich nation. Of course we are. But what's really driving this oil and gas boom is ingenuity. It's American ingenuity. These are technologies that really don't, that the rest of the world still hasn't caught up with. And the United States, it's these wildcatters who are entrepreneurs who go out there and they're so technologically advanced that they're now drilling 3 miles deep into the ground, which is, to me, that's kind of a mind-numbing thing in and of itself. And then they have this new technology that's called horizontal drilling. How many of you have heard of horizontal drilling? I mean, if you haven't heard of it, this is one of the big breakthroughs that's created this revolution in oil and gas development in the United States. And what horizontal drilling allows these wells to do is, they're drilling way down and then they go out like a spider web in any direction. And that makes these wells incredibly more efficient and productive. And then, of course, the other major breakthrough that's made this all possible is hydraulic fracturing or fracking. And what fracking is, I mean, you all know this because, again, you live here. Most people are really confused about what this is. This is simply a process by which they are emitting at very rapid speeds. Because, look, the oil and gas is trapped in the shale rock, and that shale rock is incredibly thick and dense. It's like an armor plate. And I was feeling this rock. It's amazing. You can crack through this. And what they do is emit at very rapid speed water and chemicals and sand into this rock formation. And they're finally able to pierce through that rock and crack through it. And once they do, it's like taking a champagne bottle and shaking it up. And all that oil and gas that's been stored there, it flows to the very top of the rigs. Now, why am I telling you? Why am I boring you with this story about what's happening in North Dakota? And the answer to that question is very simple. Ladies and gentlemen, because of hydraulic fracturing, which I believe is maybe one of the great technological inventions of the last 50 years, and because of horizontal drilling, we have more oil and gas in North Dakota than Saudi Arabia has. Now that's an amazing thing to think about. And it's not just happening in North Dakota. You all know that. I mean, it's happening, Texas is another perfect example. Texas is a state that just in the last 5 years has tripled its oil and gas output. Amazing story. Oklahoma, I was just out in Oklahoma last week in Oklahoma City. They're doubling their oil and gas output. And then, of course, you have here on the East Coast the Marcellus Shale, which is the biggest natural gas. And the Marcellus Shale, as you all know, is a natural gas play. So it's basically, it starts in, how many of you ever been to the town of Wheeling, West Virginia? Anybody been to Wheeling? I mean, Wheeling, I hope you're not from Wheeling because I don't want to offend anyone. But, I went to Wheeling about 10 years ago. I mean, Wheeling, West Virginia was a pretty depressing place to go to. It was like the armpit of America. I mean, just, the kind of epicenter of the Rust Belt in America with closed down steel mills and closed down coal factories and every other store in foreclosure. Just, I couldn't imagine people wanting to live in this place. It was so depressing. You go to Wheeling, West Virginia today, it's boomtown USA. People are getting, they're making more millionaires in Wheeling, West Virginia than any other city, and it's all because Wheeling sits atop of the Marcellus Shale, and they're drilling like crazy there. And you all know that the Marcellus Shale goes from West Virginia into parts of Ohio, and obviously it flows through the great state of Pennsylvania and even to upstate New York. And so all of these states are making huge amounts of money off of this. People are getting rich off of it, and we're producing a huge amount of oil and gas. And the great part of the story is that It's quite, and in fact, it's just interesting. I've been saying this for the last 3 or 4 years, and when I used to say it, people were kind of surprised and shocked and even didn't believe it to be true. But now this has become almost a conventional wisdom because almost everyone is saying it, that within the next 5 or 6 years, the United States of America, this great, great country of ours, we are going to move from being an oil and gas import country to an oil and gas export country. Now that is an amazing thing that no one 10 or 20 years ago ever beyond their wildest dreams thought was possible. And it is possible, it is going to happen. All we have to do is we have the resources, we have to go after them. I mean, California alone has about $2 trillion worth of oil and gas in their Monterey Shale, and we've got it all over the country. This is happening everywhere. And so that changes everything. That changes your future considerably. It makes America an incredibly richer country with huge additions of jobs. It makes us much less susceptible to the kind of international security concerns in the Middle East because, I mean, think about the country. What is the one thing the United States imports more of than anything else in the world? Oil, right? We spend still to this day, about $250 to $300 billion a year importing this stuff. A lot of it comes from Canada and Mexico, but a lot of it comes from countries that are extremely hostile to the United States. Countries like Venezuela, countries like Iran, countries like Saudi Arabia. I mean, think how this changes the whole global geopolitical situation if the United States is selling this stuff rather than buying it. So that's you. And by the way, you all know this plays, just to bring this right up to date to the very hour, the whole crisis that's happening in Ukraine and Russia. What's that all about? Right? What is that whole crisis about? It's about energy, right? The Russian economy is a totally oil and gas export dominated economy. The reason they've invaded parts of Ukraine and Crimea is, guess what? The pipelines that feed oil and gas and energy into Western Europe, those go through Ukraine. That's what this is about, right? So about 70% of the oil and gas that Western Europe uses for their electricity comes from Russia. So they're kind of at the blade of a knife with respect to Putin. Now, again, one of the things we should be doing today, I think President Obama should, if he really wanted to put the hurt to Putin, what he should announce today is we're just going to go balls to the walls on producing as much oil and gas as we can in this country, and then start exporting it to Western Europe, so they're not dependent on Putin for the oil and gas. I mean, so that's just an example, one example of how oil dominates so much of this foreign policy. One of my favorite stories, by the way, about what's happening, and this is something that's happening in Pennsylvania. There is a big movement, I think even in Pennsylvania, to stop fracking. Right? Fracking is evil. No, we don't want fracking. We don't want all these jobs. We don't want the energy and so on. We want to keep that stuff in the ground. And so there's a pretty big political movement. I think in Colorado, there are a number of towns. Colorado's another state that has a lot of energy resources. They actually passed a ban on fracking in several towns in Colorado. And many of you know, any New Yorkers in this room? A few of you. I don't know if you're aware of this, but some of those politicians in Albany, who are not the smartest people in the world, they actually passed a ban on fracking in New York, which is a damn shame because the Marcellus Shale actually goes up into areas in upstate New York that are kind of economically depressed, places like Syracuse and places like Buffalo and Rochester that actually could really use those jobs. So what I love is, you probably know this being Pennsylvanians, you know what they're doing here in Pennsylvania? They're drilling down, they're going horizontally under New York, and they're taking out all their oil and gas. I mean, only in the US, only in America would that happen. But the point I'm making is this changes the whole economic scene. And one of the things to think about, and one of the reasons I'm very bullish on America, quite frankly, is because guess what country in the world today has the lowest price electricity of all the industrialized countries? We do. We do. Our electricity prices have dramatically declined, especially for industrial production, relative to Europe and Asia and some of these other countries. Now, that may not seem like a big deal, but it is a big deal because one of the exciting things that's happening in America, it's happening in Pennsylvania, it's happening in Ohio, it's happening in Michigan, it's happening in Oklahoma, it's happening all over this country. We are starting to see a real renaissance in manufacturing again in America. I was just in Grand Rapids, Michigan a couple of weeks ago. Grand Rapids is booming. Why? Because their energy costs are so low, they're able to produce a lot of these car parts and so on that used to be produced in Europe at lower cost than they can produce them in Europe. That's a big deal. We're also seeing, in terms of the chemical industry, in terms of the plastics industry, our high technology industry, all of those are being greatly, greatly benefited from the fact that we have this low-priced energy. The other kind of interesting part of the story, I don't want to belabor it too much, but you have European countries, what have they been doing over the last 10 years? Well, while we've been developing our oil and gas resources, they have invested in all these green energy sources, right? So they've invested hugely in windmills, solar power, and green energies like that. Guess what? That hasn't worked out so well for them, right? Because the cost of producing, kilowatt of electricity from a windmill or solar power is 4 or 5 times higher than it is to produce a kilowatt of electricity from natural gas or coal. And so what's happening in these countries is that, guess what? They are actually moving out of green energy in Europe. My favorite story is Germany, which we always think of Germany as German manufacturing, German engineering. Germany actually has now decided that major companies in Germany and major plants, they're going to close them down in Germany, and guess where they're going to move them to? Here in the United States. That's called insourcing of jobs, and that's something that hasn't happened in the United States for a long, long, long time. We're going to see more of that unless these countries abandon their green energy. Now, let me just show you one other thing, and then I'll move on to some other stuff. But if you look at this, so the United States has also spent a lot of money on green energy over the last 6 or 7 years. Under the Bush administration, we spent a lot of money on this renewable energy stuff. And under Obama, as you know, he spent tens of billions of dollars on this. So over the last 5 years, we spent about $100 billion of taxpayer money on windmills and solar power and so on, because these were supposed to be the energies of the future. And if you look at this chart, look at this. Oil and gas has gone up 4 times in terms of production compared to what all the renewables are. So the renewables, I think the renewable energy industry is in a boatload of trouble right now, because green energy just can't compete in an open market with cheap gas and cheap coal and so on. And so, that's a pretty cool story, I think, of American ingenuity, and it's a really strong reason to feel very bullish about the U.S. economy in the future. Now, that said, I want to pivot over to a second topic, which is this so-called recovery we're in. I touched on this a minute ago. But if you look at the U.S. economy today, what I've done here is I've just tried to very concisely summarize this recovery versus the recovery we had back in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan. Now, I have to confess I'm a little biased. I worked for the Gipper back in 86 and 87 and 88, so he has a special place in my heart. But if you just look at the raw statistics on this, and I love this chart. I debated Paul Krugman a few months ago on this stuff, and this argument just drove him absolutely crazy, because the left doesn't really have a very strong response to this. And the point I made to Krugman and the others, and that I'll make to you, is that we've had 2 presidents now in the last 40 years who have come into office during terrible economic crises. The first president was Ronald Reagan, and you're all too young to remember this, but I graduated in college in 1981, 82, so I remember it very vividly. You think the economy is bad now, you should have lived through the late 70s and early 80s. It was like, I believe it was a mini depression we lived through in that period. And so the economy was just sinking. Anybody in this room old enough to remember 20% mortgage interest rates or 14% inflation? The economy was in the crapper, no question about that. And in fact, if you go back and read your history books about what people were saying back then in 79 and 80 and 81, they were like, America's greatest days are behind us. The Russians are going to, the Soviet Union is going to just kick our butt economically, and we're past our glory days and so on. And then, of course, the other president who came in during a great economic crisis was Barack Obama, right? The U.S. economy, you all remember what it was like in 2008 and 2009. We lost 7 million jobs. The housing market collapsed. The stock market went through one of its worst bear markets in history. And as Barack Obama says, he walked in the Oval Office the day he walked into the office, and there's a 12% unemployment rate in this country. So this sets up a great natural experiment, right? That you don't very often find in life. Obama walks in, the economy is collapsing. Reagan walks in, and the economy is collapsing. And then what's interesting about this experiment is that these 2 presidents used diametrically opposite approaches to dealing with the crisis. So Reagan came in, and what did he do? Well, the first thing we did was cut tax rates. So I'll show you that in a minute. We cut tax rates very substantially. The second thing is we cut some government spending. The third thing we did was deregulate key elements of the economy. The fourth thing he did, actually this came even before all of that, we pulled back on the money supply to sweat inflation out of the system, so that we went from 14 to 3% on inflation. So this was a very kind of pro-supply side, pro-free market, pro-business approach to regenerating growth in the United States. Barack Obama comes in, and as I said, he did just the opposite. You all remember the $830 billion stimulus plan. This was the idea, you know, the government's going to spend all this money, and it's going to have this, you know, multiplier effect, and we're going to have this Keynesian, I don't know, do they still teach Keynesian economics here? You know, this is the idea, you know, you're going to get all this huge, you know, $2 and $3 of return for every dollar that we spend in the economy, and so on. And then we had the Obamacare bill, and then we had a huge amount of money creation by the Fed, so they were just spitting out money into the economy. And then we had, you know, the Cash for Clunkers program and all these things, you know, paying people to buy new cars. One program after another, all of these government interventions. And then the question you have to ask yourself is, okay, here's our experiment, you know, a supply-side pro-market approach to economic revival and a kind of government expansion model. Which one worked best? And so if you look at this, what you see here is that in the last 5 years, this is why it's been such a crummy, it feels like such a crummy recovery, because in 5 years, the economy's only grown by 11%. That's about a 2% annual average. That's pretty bad. You know, it's not horrible, it's not a recession, but it's pretty meek recovery. Then you look at under Reagan, we had 24.5% in the same period. Now, you know, that may not seem like that's big of a deal, 11% versus 24%. So that's why if you look at the, you know, this gap here, what it amounts to is that if we had had the same recovery under Barack Obama that we did under Reagan, today we would have $1.9 trillion larger economy, or $1.9 trillion more GDP. Now, that's a pretty darn big number, right? $1.9 trillion. Let me, again, these numbers, when we talk in the billions of trillions, the numbers are so large they're hard to kind of comprehend. So let me put it this way, that if we spread that $2 trillion equally throughout America to every family, that would mean every family in the United States today would have $12,000 to $15,000 more income a year. That's a big deal, right? By the way, over the same time period, the American families don't have $12,000 to $15,000 more income. They've actually lost $2,000 of income, even in this recovery. And so I would just make the case to you that this is a pretty strong, you know, argument about why it is that free markets triumph over government intervention. Now, I want to show you one other kind of chart that I think you might find interesting. I just finished this book. I forgot to mention to you, I actually do have a new book out that just came out 2 weeks ago, and it's this. The name of the book is called The Wealth of States, sort of a play on the wealth of nations. And what this book is about is it really looks at why some states in America have been growing so rapidly and other states are falling so far behind. And I don't want to get too much into this. You can read the book. I don't want to spoil the ending for you. But you know, the point that we make is that, you know, you've got this big divide in America between these kind of red states that are, you know, Republican governors, Republican legislatures, mostly in the South and the Dakotas, in Arizona, and, you know, Kansas and places like that. And then you've got these blue states that are dominated by Democrats. And by the way, the divide is getting wider. So you have states like New York and Massachusetts and Connecticut and New Jersey and California and my home state of Illinois that are just completely dominated by Democrats. And so what's happening in these states is another kind of natural experiment. The blue states are adopting, you know, to put this kind of very shorthand way, is the blue states are doing Obamonomics, right? They're pulling back on drilling, they have union work rules, they have high tax rates and so on. And the red states are doing the opposite. They're cutting their tax rates. They are right to work states, which means you don't have to join a union in that state if you don't want to. They are states that are going, you know, full speed ahead on drilling and so on. And so the question is, which of these models is working better? Now, let me, it turns out, and this is kind of just a very compact way of making this argument, that the four biggest states in the United States today are California and Texas and Florida and New York, right? So, and this is a nice experiment as well, because guess what? Two of those states, California and New York, are very liberal states, and the other two are, well, Texas is a very conservative state, and Florida is a pretty conservative state, not nearly as conservative as Texas is. And when I say conservative, I mean conservative in their economic policies. Now, like, one thing to consider is that Florida and Texas have one huge economic advantage over California and New York, and that advantage is that in California, I mean in Texas and Florida, the income tax rate in Texas and Florida is what? 0. There's no income tax in those states. That's a huge advantage for anybody who wants to start up a business, or any high-income individual. You know, you saw the story recently about, you know, Tiger Woods and Phil Mickelson leaving leaving California to move to Florida because there's no income tax in those states. So the question is, does any of this matter? And you can see here, these are your red states, Texas and Florida. They've had, over the last 20 years, 3 or 4 times the growth rate in jobs than California and New York. And in fact, one of my favorite statistics, again, I told this to Krugman, it drove him absolutely crazy. I said, because he loves California, he loves their model. I love California, by the way. I think California, any Californians in this room? I mean, California is a great, great, great place. I mean, what I don't understand is how you screw up California, right? I mean, it's beautiful mountains, beautiful beaches, beautiful weather, beautiful women. There's nothing not to like about California, and yet the politicians are just destroying that state. And so if you look over this is over the last 20 years, if you look over the last 5 years, in 5 years' time, California has lost 1 million jobs, and over that same 5-year period, Texas has gained 1 million jobs. That's a stunning, transfer of economic power from one state to another, where the sort of geographical center of power in this country is shifting to the south because of these trends, and it's happening each and every day. When I brought this up to Paul Krugman, by the way, he was saying, well, this is just nonsense. He said, the only reason people are moving, from these high-tax states to these low-tax states is because of the weather. Right? It's the weather that's doing it. And no, I mean, look, there's something to it. Clearly, if you're living in Minneapolis, Minnesota, it's a lot nicer to live in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, right? I mean, so there is some weather effect here. People are getting older. They do want to move from, places that are damn cold in the winter, to places that have, nicer weather and more sunshine. But, then I asked Krugman, I said, if you think people are moving, these trends are all driven by weather, then Paul, please explain to me why people are leaving San Diego and they're going to Houston. Because they're not doing that for the weather, right? I mean, everybody who's been to San Diego, you don't leave San Diego to go to Houston, and yet that's what they're doing. This is driven by economic policies, not by the weather. Now, I want to show you a couple of other things. I just thought I'd show you this because this is just our ranking of states and where they are likely to be. This comes from our book. In other words, we do a forecast. We look at like 15 variables: taxes, right to work, regulatory policies, all this stuff. Do they allow drilling? Do they not allow drilling? And what we have here is a kind of an index of which states we think will grow the most and which states we think will grow the least amount. Now you can see the growth states are going to be Utah, South Dakota, Indiana, North Dakota, and Idaho. Those are our 5 top growth prospects. The bottom 5, no surprise: Minnesota, California, Illinois, Vermont, New York. Those are states that just get it all wrong. And then here's Pennsylvania. I mean, Pennsylvania can do much, much better. You're 34th. You're below average in terms of your growth policies. So things have to change here. You've got to, one of the things, if I were in the legislature as you were, I would eliminate your state income tax. If you want to get jobs back in this state, become the 10th state in the country that has no income tax, and people will stampede back into the state. It's a shame what's happening in Pennsylvania. People are leaving the state. Young people, I don't know how many of you are going to actually be, when you graduate, staying in the state, but the jobs are just not as plentiful. I mean, I guarantee you, any one of you who doesn't have a job lined up, if you go to Houston, you'll have a job in a week. I mean, they have the lowest, incredibly low unemployment rate there. So there are jobs in this country. They're just not in some of the places that they should be in. Now, I want to show you kind of what's going on with the national economy over the last 50 years. I want to give you a very, very quick and concise economic history lesson because I think this is really an important. It's important to understand why is it over the last half century we've seen these periods of dramatic growth in the economy, and we've seen periods of dramatic decline. And so the blue line here is just the stock market. So I'm taking the stock market here as a proxy for how the U.S. economy does over time. It's not perfect, but it's a pretty good indication of good times versus bad times. And so you can see here, this is anyone with a computer terminal, you've seen this blue line 1,000 times. The green line, what I've done is I've just inflation adjusted the returns, because anytime you make an investment, I mean, any of you want to go in the investment business, you know this, or anyone who just wants to invest your own money, you should know that when you make an investment, you're interested in your after inflation, not your before inflation rate of return, right? You have to take into account inflation, what return did you have? Now, what's interesting about this chart is look at this period here. Look at this. This is the late 60s through the 70s. The 1970s was the worst decade for the U.S. economy since the Great Depression. I mean, it was an awful period. So much so that over this whole period, in real terms, stocks from 1968 to 1981-82 lost 64% of their value in real terms. Can we all agree that's a pretty bear market when stocks lose 2/3 of their value over a 12-year period? I mean, that is just a evaporation of wealth. And then, we bottomed out in the summer of 1982. And then, the way I like to put it, again, I'm a little parochial here, but the way I put it is that clouds finally dispersed over the American economy. The sun finally came out, and God gave America Ronald Reagan, right? And look at what happens over the next 20 years. You see the biggest, what you're looking at here, from the early 80s through the year 2000, this is the greatest period of wealth creation and income gain in the history of civilization. No country has ever seen anything like what happened in the United States over a 20-year period, like what happened in the U.S. in the 80s and 90s. And by the way, just so you think I'm not making some kind of rah-rah Republican argument, I'm not. The boom began in the early 80s, you can see this, but it even accelerated under Bill Clinton, a Democratic president. We talked a little bit at lunch about this. Some of you were in the room when we were talking about this. Clinton, his first 2 years were a disaster, but then he moved to the middle politically, and he had an incredible run of the country did spectacularly well economically in Bill Clinton's last 6 years in office. And so, that is what we should strive for in America. That's sort of the main point I'm making here. How do we get back on this virtuous path of dramatic gains in income and wealth in the United States and job creation? Yeah. Sorry, what?
The green line.
The green line?
I see the blue line. That's the recovery. What's the green line?
That's the S&P 500 adjusted for inflation. Okay, so the green is the inflation-adjusted rate of return. The blue is just the nominal rate of return. Now, okay, the other point I wanted to make to you then is that that now let's kind of fast forward it to the last 12 years. How many of you, any of you see, there was a lead story, front page story today in the New York Times. I don't normally read the New York Times, but about 15 people emailed it to me. I'm going to have to write a piece about this. There's a big piece in the New York Times about the decline in the middle class in America. Did any of you see that today? You might want to take a look at this if you get, just Google it when you get back to your computer. A big story about how the middle class has been just suffering big income gains that go back to the year 2000. And they made this point that I don't think is really very correct, but they made this point that the average person in the middle class today is less wealthy than the average person in Europe. And I don't actually believe that. I think Europe is a catastrophe right now. But they were saying, the Germans and Swedes and so on have a higher middle class income today than our middle class because the last 10 years has been so lousy. Not the last 10 years, since about 2001 to 2014. So the last 12 to 13 years, we've just not had much of a recovery. And by the way, what they didn't say in the story is that may be true, that over this period we haven't seen many gains for the middle class. But in this period, oh my God, the middle class saw about a 30 to 35% increase in their compensation, in their wealth, and the things they could buy. So this was the golden age for the middle class. Now you see, here's where we are in the last 12 years. By the way, this happened in 1999 and 2000, this collapse here. Anybody know what that was? What?
The dot-com bubble.
Yes, the dot-com bubble burst. It's so surprising how many people have forgotten about that, right? I mean, the dot-com bubble just collapsed in 99 and 2000. You could see this was a big shattering of the economy. And this is $8 trillion of wealth as all these companies, I mean, Amazon almost went out of business during this, and they came this close to collapsing, but all these dot-coms and all these high technology companies just sunk in value. And it took a long time. You see 2003, 4, 5, 6, 7, finally the market kind of got back where it was. And then, of course, you all know what happened in 2008, which was the housing market just absolutely collapsed. I think this was a result of really bad monetary policy where we're pumping money into the economy, and it all went into housing. And we had the subprime crisis, and you can see again, here's the second big collapse. And here's where Obama, comes into office. And by the way, Obama, the stock market's done really well under Obama. It's just incomes haven't gone up nearly at all under Obama, except for the top 2%. And so the real question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we get out of this rut that we've been in for the last 13 years? How do we get back to this, right? How do we get back to this path where America's incomes are rising at a fairly steady pace? Now, I would make the case, so I think to understand the answer to that question, you have to go back and say, well, what did we do in the late 70s, early 80s to get out of the last crisis with respect to a slow economy and declining incomes? And so this is, let me just make this really quick because I'm talking too long. So two big things happened in the early 80s that turned around the economy and allowed this huge flourishing of wealth. The first thing was a dramatic reduction in tax rates. And by the way, in this New York Times article, it's so weird. They kept saying, like, so what we have to do to regain income in the United States is have tax rates like they have in Europe. And I'm like, what? You know, why would we do that? I mean, that's gonna move us back to where we were in the 70s. And they even said in this piece, you know, gosh, these progressive countries in Europe, they have 60 and 70% tax rates, and we don't tax our rich enough in the US, and that's our problem. And I wish I could show these guys this, because they just don't have their tray tables in the upright and locked position when it comes to this stuff. And so if you look at, you know, this green line here, that's the highest tax rate in the United States. So if you go back to the 1970s, it's hard to believe, but we actually did have a 70% tax rate in the United States. And to understand how dysfunctional that is, and it's hard for me to believe that these people in the New York Times say, maybe we should go back to that. When you have a 70% tax rate, what that means is that for every additional dollar that you're earning, by definition, the government gets 70 cents out of that dollar, right? And you get to keep 30 cents out of the dollar. So if you invest it or you work to earn it in a wage or salary, you're only getting 30 cents back on the dollar. And so what happened was that there were people like the Wall Street Journal editorial page, people like Jack Kemp, and people like Ronald Reagan and others who were making the case these tax rates were so high they were just suffocating growth and they were stopping job creation and business creation. And so you see what happens under Reagan. I mean, this is a big deal. The top tax rate went from 70% down to 50, all the way down to 28%. That's a big, 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 big deal to go to 70 to 28, because this means, you know, at the start of this period, you only got to keep 30 cents after tax on the dollar. At the end of the period, when Reagan left office, you got to keep 72 cents, right? Because it's $1 minus 28-cent tax, so you get to keep 72. So the after-tax rate of return on working and investing doubled, more than doubled. It's not too surprising when that happened, you saw the economy expand. Now, you can see the rates, the green line, they bumped up and down a little bit, but they've remained relatively stable in the 30 to 40% range over the last 10 years. What's really interesting about this chart is look at the yellow line. That is the share of taxes in the United States that are paid by the richest 1%. The richest 1%. Now look at this. This is a paradox, right? As the tax rates went down, look at what happened to the share of taxes paid by the rich. They went up. They went up. I mean, that New York Times reporter would say, you want to get more tax revenues out of the rich, cut their tax rates, don't raise them, and history proves this. And you can see, I mean, when we had a 70% tax rate, the top 1% paid 19% of the income tax. Today, the top 1% pay almost 40% of the income tax. I mean, that's extraordinary. Let me show you one, I got to show you this quote, because I love this quote. It's my favorite quote from modern day American history. This is John F. Kennedy. He said this 50 years ago, and these are just words to live by. It is a paradox. He said this, by the way, shortly before he was assassinated in Dallas in '63. He said, it is a paradoxical truth that tax rates are too high today and tax revenues are too low, and the soundest way to raise the revenues in the long run is to cut the rates now. Wow. That's amazing. A Democrat said that 50 years ago. I don't think you can find a single Democrat in Congress today who would believe that. In fact, half of the Republicans probably don't believe it. But Kennedy was right. We did cut the tax rates and we did get more revenues when he did that. So one other kind of thing I wanted to show to you, this is the Barack Obama simple tax form. You know, it's really simple. It's 2 lines. How much money did you make? Send it in. You know, it can't get much simpler than that, right? But I just wanted to show you one other thing, because this gets to the heart of what the New York Times was talking about today. They were saying the big problem in America today is the rich aren't paying enough tax. Well, that's BS, right? That's ridiculous. If you look at our tax system today, the top 1%, here they make about 20% of the income in the country. So that's a big slice. 1% make 1/5 of the income. But 1% also pay almost 40% of the income tax. That's, by the way, a larger share of the income tax than any other country in the world that we compete with. It's more than Germany. It's more than in Spain and Italy and Australia and Japan. So the rich in the United States pay a bigger share of the income tax than almost any other country. What's interesting is the bottom 50% in America all Americans with an income below the median, they pay 2% of the income tax. So it's a highly, highly progressive tax system. And what this is telling us, by the way, is if we want to balance the budget and get more revenues into the government, we're going to have to produce a lot more rich people, right? And we need more, you know, of these evil people like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates and, you know, Tiger Woods and Hannah Montana and people like that, because they pay so much of the tax burden. Now, the other thing that happened, I'm going to speed up a little bit because I've been talking too long and falling behind. The inflation, and I don't want to bore you too much with this, but you know, here's what I was talking about in 1980 when we had the gigantic rates of inflation. And you know, for those of you who are, you know, most of you weren't even born in 1980, so you can't remember this. In 1980, I was a senior in high school, and I was working as a grocery store clerk. And this, you know, what I used to do is I would live in Chicago. I'd come home from school, ride my bike over to this corner grocery store. And before they had all the barcodes, you know, the computer barcodes on the merchandise, back in the good old days, we used to put the sticker prices on everything. So we had this little sticker machine, and my job at the grocery store was when new merchandise came in, the Wheaties and the, you know, the cans of vegetables and so on, I'd take the sticker machine and I would put the prices on everything. You know, $1.29 for this, $1.89 for that, and so on, and we'd stock the shelves. Well, once a week I would come in and my boss would say, Steve, the inflation rate just went up again, so we got to put higher prices on everything. So I'd have to go down the aisles with the sticker machine, and this isn't now $1.29, it's $1.49 and so on. And I'll never forget this. I'd be walking down the aisle with this thing, and these people would look at me suspiciously, and they'd start grabbing anything off the shelf, you know, before I could, and I'd get in these tug of wars with these little old ladies. They'd want the, you know, the Wheaties box at $1.49, I'd try to make $1.69. And the joke back then, by the way, in 1980, do you remember this one, that if you saw a dollar bill lying on the ground, you pick it up to see if there was anything of value underneath it, because the inflation had just eroded so much the value of the dollar. Well, here's the story of the U.S. economy. You know, look at what happened to the inflation rate in 18 months. It went from 14% to about 3.5%. That is a miracle, by the way. There is no Keynesian economy anywhere in the country, from Harvard to Stanford, who thought that this was possible. No one did. They saw there is no way you can bring inflation down like this and then have a robust recovery like we did. But that's exactly what happened. Anybody, by the way, know who the Federal Reserve Chairman was at this time? Paul Volcker. So this was the Reagan-Volcker disinflation. And then one of the reasons the economy's performed so well on balance over the last 20 years has been that you can see inflation's been very low and tame over this period. And then I'll just show you one thing that I think will kind of blow you away. This is what we've done with our money supply in the last, you know, last 2 or 3 or 4 years. You can see, you know, this is the supply of money that the Fed is pumping in the economy. And look at that. I mean, look at that. It's like, you know, this is like Mount Everest, right? I mean, we doubled the amount of money in the economy here, and then we more than doubled. We have QE1, QE2. How many of you heard of QE1, QE2, QE3? I mean, there's just more and more money that the Fed keeps pumping into the economy. Now, just one quick point I want to make about this. How many of you had at least one economics course? Most of you? Okay, so you know then, if I showed you this chart, and I said this is the monetary policy of a certain country, but I didn't tell you what country that was, what do you think is going on in this country? What's happening in this country? Inflation. If you see the money supply going through the roof, you're probably going to have higher prices of things, right? Because you're printing more money. Remember this from your Economics 100 class? Remember this one? What is inflation? Inflation is too many dollars chasing too few goods, right? Well, when you have a doubling and tripling in the supply of money, you would expect inflation to be, you know, the hallmark of the U.S. economy right now. Except guess what? There is no inflation out there right now. I mean, it's tame. We've got about a 2% inflation rate. The CPI just came out a couple weeks ago. We've got inflation over the last 3 years that's been lower than any time it has in the last 50 years. Now that's a conundrum, right? How can that happen? How can you have record amounts of money creation and then really low inflation? And I don't want to get into this too much, but the answer is, guess what people aren't doing with this money? They're not spending it, banks aren't lending it, investors aren't investing it. So it's not circulating through the economy. It's almost like what people are doing is taking all this money that the Fed is printing and stuffing it under their mattress. I mean, that's but that's sort of what they're doing. And if the money doesn't circulate through the economy, it doesn't cause inflation. I am worried about inflation, by the way. If the economy starts getting going, which let's keep our fingers crossed it's going to start doing in the months ahead, as people start spending more money, I think you might see inflation creep up. Now, I want to make 2 other quick points, and then I'm going to open up to some questions. We talked a little bit about this at lunch, but it's an issue I feel so passionately about, and that is when you look at the U.S. economy over the last 10 years, you know, when I talk about inflation, every industry has its own rate of growth of inflation. So some things, you know, see higher increases in prices, some see smaller increases in prices, some see declines in prices. And so what I did was I looked at the official Bureau of Labor Statistics CPI data, but I looked at it by various industries, and I looked at it over the last 10 to 12 years. And what I measured is where are we seeing increases in prices and where we're seeing a decline in prices. Now, if you look at these pillars, this is cars and trucks, this is clothing, this is software, these are computers. These are coming down in price. That's a good news story, a really good news story. That means these things are becoming more and more affordable to more and more Americans over time. They're cheaper over time. And by the way, one of the reasons free trade, I was interested when I walked in this building, there was some kind of a placard on, come and see the case for fair trade. Well, no, free trade is fair trade, because the reason that free trade is so important is what free trade does is it lowers prices for American consumers, and it makes Americans wealthier. And so you can see this wealth effect from these declining prices of all these things where that you face import competition. Now, let's turn to where the prices are growing the fastest. Energy is kind of a special case, but education and healthcare. Education and healthcare. Now, the question I would ask you all is, what do those two industries have in common? Energy and healthcare. Well, let me put it differently. Who runs those two industries? The government does, right? The education industry is about 70% run by government, and the healthcare industry in America today is exactly 50% public and exactly 50% private. So it's a bifurcated system. Now, what's interesting, isn't it interesting that the two industries that are most dominated by the government are the industries that have the fastest rate of inflation? Wait a minute, you know, we passed Obamacare. President Obama said we're going to bend the cost curve down, everything's going to be cheaper. With all due respect, Mr. President, when has that ever worked, right? When has that ever worked in healthcare? And education, I mean, again, I have a son who goes to Northwestern. He's a senior. Anybody want to guess what I'm paying now at Northwestern, room, board, and tuition for all in per year? $62,500. That's like thievery. That's stealing, right? I mean, where do they get away with that? So I'm not kidding. When my son was packing his bags, ready to go off to college, you all remember this. When you go off to college, it's a very emotional day. I put my arm around my son. He's packing his bags. I said, you know, I promised you I would pay your tuition and, you know, pay for your 4 years of college, and I'm going to honor that promise. But I said, Justin, I wasn't that excited about going to Northwestern anyway because it's a very liberal school. I'm pretty conservative. So I said, Justin, you can go to Northwestern for 4 years, or I'll write you a check for $200,000 right now. You can play computer games for 4 years, and we'll both be a lot better off. He said, yeah, but you know, you have to really wonder, is college really worth $200,000? I think not. On healthcare, just one thing to think about. Just one little kind of thing to think about in terms of why our healthcare crisis exists and why Obamacare is the wrong approach. The real problem with healthcare, in my opinion, is this third-party payer system where the people are paying the bills aren't the people, the patients aren't paying the bills. It's all paid by insurance or Medicare and Medicaid. And I'll just tell you one kind of quick story to, you know, to kind of crystallize what I'm talking about. When I was, about 5 years ago, I went skiing up in Vail. And when this snowboarder came and he smashed me from behind, I went flying and I jolted my shoulder on the snow when I landed. And when I got up, I couldn't even lift my arm above my shoulder, and I'm left-handed, so this was a big problem. So when I got back to Northern Virginia, I went to see the orthopedic surgeon, and I said, you know, what's the problem here? He took the x-rays, the MRI. He said, Steve, I said, you got a small problem here. He said, you've got a tear in your rotator cuff. And he said, you know, you've got two options here. He said, one option is to have surgery and we can stitch that up, and then you're going to have to go through all sorts of treatment and so on after that. Or he said, I can give you some physical therapy and maybe that'll build up the muscles and you won't have to have the surgery. He said, but you may tear it later, so you know, it's probably advisable to have the surgery. So I turned to the doctor and said, well, doctor, I just have one question for you. I said, if I have this surgery, about how much money is this going to cost? And he looked at me with the strangest expression. And he said, Steve, I've been doing these surgeries for 20 years. And in 20 years, you are the first patient who ever asked me how much this is going to cost. Now think about that. We're Americans, right? We always ask what things cost. I mean, that would like be going to a new car showroom and saying, oh, I love that red sports car, just buying it without asking what it costs. I mean, surgery is an expensive thing. It's one of the most expensive things we're ever going to purchase as a consumer in our lifetime, and nobody asked what it costs. By the way, then the doctor turned to me and said, by the way, Steve, I have no idea how much it's going to cost. So can you see what's going on here? I mean, I would make the case to you, when you have a pricing system where neither the doctor nor the patient have any idea what these things cost, the pricing system isn't working, right? We have a pricing system to allocate scarce resources. That's what prices do in a free market system. We're not using that in healthcare, and it's a reason these costs are through the roof. And I'm very skeptical Obamacare is going to make that better. In fact, I would make the case it's going to make it worse. Last point. The other reason to be optimistic, and I just have to show you this because I think it is so important. I am an optimist about the U.S. economy, and I believe in my heart that for all of you, this is the most exciting time ever to be alive in the history of the world. There's just no question about it. What we are looking forward to in the next 10 and 20 and 50 years is unbelievable progress. And one of the ways I try to get this point across to young people like you all is looking at how things have changed over the last 100 years, because people don't really appreciate the dramatic changes we've gone through. So what I did in this little study I did a few years ago was I looked at old inventions versus new inventions. And I said, how long did it take from the time something was first invented to the time the average American with a middle income could afford to buy these things? And so I started with telephones, and you could see that 71 number there? What that means is that it took 71 years from the time Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone to the time the average American with a middle income could afford to have a telephone in their house. 71 years. That's 3 generations it took for that new technology to penetrate the market. Then I looked at the next one, electricity. It took 50 years, a half a century, from the time the richest Americans, the people like the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts, and the Carnegies and so on, had electricity pumped into their house, to the time the average American with a middle income. 50 years, that's a long time. It took 30 years for TV, it took 20 years for radio and so on. Now look at the modern age. I mean, look at this. iPods, and iPods took 4 years, internet took 10 years from the time, Al Gore invented the internet in 1994 till today. It took 10 years till everybody had it. Same thing with cell phones and all these things. I mean, this is an amazing point. And the point I'm making is that these new things that are invented, they become affordable almost instantly. How many of you in this room have an iPhone? Raise your hand. About 2/3 of you do. An iPhone, I mean, this is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. The iPhone, I think the original iPhone came out about 6 years ago, and that was a phone that cost about $400 to get the iPhone. Today, you can get an iPhone for about $159. It's a far superior machine than the one that you could have gotten even 5 or 6 years ago, and it costs less than half of what it did. And if you're nice enough to have me back 2 or 5 years from now, I mean, 5 years from now, the iPhone is going to cost $29, right? These things are coming down, down, down in price. It's quite conceivable in 5 or 6 years, everyone on the planet, everyone, even the poorest places in Africa, is going to have an iPhone. That's an amazing thing to think about. And so these things are hard for your generation to comprehend. I mean, my kids are like, well, duh, of course we have these things. We got iPods and all this stuff. And so I just thought I'd show you this because I think this is an amazing picture. Anybody know what movie that is? That's Wall Street. If you haven't seen it, it's a great piece, period piece. It was made in 1987. That's Michael Douglas, and he plays the part of Gordon Gekko, the rich fat cat on Wall Street. Now, and he was like, the multi-millionaire on Wall Street. And this is a scene. He's walking down the beaches of Atlantic City, and look at that thing he's got in his hand. I mean, look at that thing. It's like a brick with an antenna coming out of it, right? It got lousy reception. There aren't too many people you could call with it because nobody else had cell phones. Here's the amazing thing. Anybody want to take a guess at what that thing cost in 1987, which was only 25 years ago? $4,200. $4,200. Now they damn near give the things away for free. And my point is, we're seeing this not just in these electronic gadgets that we all have. It is permeating the economy. That's why when I started this conversation talking about fracking, what is fracking really about? It's about human knowledge and technology that are making things possible that weren't possible 10 and 20 and 30 years ago. And that is really the real mastery of capitalism, right? It makes things possible that were not possible in the past. And I would make the case to you, what's really cool about being alive today is for all of you, within the next 10, 20, 25 years, unquestionably, we're going to find cures for cancer and multiple sclerosis and heart disease and Alzheimer's, all these things. We're going to see over the next 10 or 25 years incredible advances in technological progress and manufacturing and so on. It's all so achievable. And that's one of the reasons, but it's only achievable through human knowledge and through the kind of profit motive. And that's, I think, why the capitalist system is so far superior to where we are now. The final point and this I promise the last point, is just that there is one big problem that's holding back this economy right now. There is one curse that is like a big break on the economy that is something your generation is going to have to deal with. And you're going to have to solve this crisis. It's like, my parents, they were part of what we call the greatest generation, right? The generation that got us out of the Great Depression and fought World War II and beat the Nazis and so on. I'm part of the Cold War, generation. We defeated the Soviet Union. The challenge that your generation is going to face is how do we deal with the $17 trillion national debt, right? I mean, I'm always so surprised that young people were so gaga over all these policies we put in place over the last 5 years, because guess what? The joke is on you. Who do you think is going to pay these bills? I'm not going to pay them. You're not going to pay them. It's your generation that's going to have to pay these bills, and your generation's children, and probably your generation's children's children are going to have to pay these bills. $17 trillion of national debt. And this is a big, big albatross around the neck of the U.S. economy. And your generation has to figure out how do we deal with this. We better grow this economy much faster, and we got to get these spending programs under control. Because I'll tell you this, there is a country now for the first time in any of our lifetimes that is challenging us for economic supremacy, and that's China. And Chinese, we had an economic minister from China come in the Wall Street Journal about 6 weeks ago, and he talked about, he said, in 5 years, we're going to surpass the United States. We're going to be bigger than you guys because we're growing like this and you're growing like this. And I said, sir, that's not going to happen. And the reason I can tell you with all certainty that China is not going to surpass the United States is because our Chinese are so much smarter than your Chinese. He didn't like that very much, but it's true, right? But that's the challenge. And so I'm going to kind of end there to say, I hope you've got it in yourselves to deal with this crisis, because we can't keep borrowing $1 trillion a year. Thank you very much. It's been great to be with you.